The hum of the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene was a familiar, comforting drone. It always sounded like a giant, patient beast digesting data, processing the grim realities I fed it. Today, that hum felt heavier, laced with a low thrum of disbelief from the initial reports. I ran a gloved hand over the cool steel of my workspace, a small ritual before diving into the day's macabre puzzle. Outside, the world beyond the insulated walls was a blur of muted greens and grays, a sprawling, isolated estate that felt miles removed from civilization, let alone a murder. Morning, UserKK, ready for a real head-scratcher. The detective's voice, rough around the edges like his perpetually rumpled suit, cut through the quiet. He was already leaning against the doorframe, a digital tablet clutched in one hand, the other gesturing vaguely towards the sprawling property visible through the unit's reinforced window. I didn't turn. As ready as I'll ever be, detective. My gaze was fixed on the sterile expanse of the main examination table, already laid out with my preferred instruments, an array of scalpels, forceps, and a digital microscope. Each tool was a silent promise of truth, waiting to be wielded. "What's the official word from the scene? Besides impossible," he grunted, pushing off the frame and stepping inside, the scent of stale coffee preceding him. "That pretty much sums it up. Victims the tech mogul Silas Thorne. He was found dead in his impenetrable smart home. No forced entry. Every sensor, every camera, every biometric lock, all reported nominal operation right up until his security manager got a no-heartbeat detected alert from his personal health monitor. That's what triggered the call." He handed me the tablet. The screen displayed a series of high-resolution crime scene photos. Thorne's face, even in death, held a ghost of the arrogance he was known for. He lay sprawled in a minimalist living area, surrounded by gleaming, futuristic furniture. I took the tablet, my fingers already scrolling through the images, not just looking, but seeing. No obvious wounds, I assume. None. Medical examiner on site did a preliminary and just shook his head. No struggle, no signs of a struggle that they could see, just dead in his own fortress, and alone according to the system logs, which, frankly, is the part that's got us all stumped. Who gets past that kind of tech without leaving a trace? The detective rubbed the back of his neck, his frustration palpable. "We've got the internal security footage, external perimeter scans, everything. It's like he just stopped breathing, and then someone wiped the camera logs for the last 2 hours of his life, but only for his specific suite. Everything else is pristine." Wiped logs. That was the first true flag. A perfect crime always had a flaw, a subtle ripple in the otherwise calm surface. I could feel the familiar tightening in my chest, a mix of apprehension and exhilaration. This was why I did what I did, to find that ripple, to expose the unseen. I continued to meticulously scroll through the photos, my internal monologue ticking through possibilities. No forced entry, wiped logs, no apparent cause of death. It screamed inside job or something far more elaborate. Silas Thorne wasn't just a tech mogul. He was known for making enemies as fast as he made billions. My eyes scanned Thorne's environment in the images, the polished concrete floors, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens, the stark, almost clinical decor. It was a sterile, controlled world. Then a detail snagged my attention, pulling me up short. My thumb hovered, zooming in on an extreme close-up of Thorne's bespoke, deep-pile rug. Event. The detective, seeing my sudden stillness, leaned closer. Something. I ignored him, my focus narrowed to a tiny imperfection in the digital image. It was a minute, almost imperceptible discoloration, not quite a stain, more like a faint dusting, on the pristine white cuff of Thorne's expensive silk pajama top. It was barely visible, a whisper of a hue against the fabric. On its own, it would mean nothing. But then I looked at the rug again, and then at the nearby automated air purifier, its blue light glowing reassuringly in the photo. This home was designed to be spotless, allergen-free. Did anyone sweep the room for environmental contaminants? I asked, my voice low, a prelude to a significant question. The detective blinked. Environmental, what like dust? Thorne was a clean freak. That place was practically a clean room. Reveal/discovery. I zoomed in further on the faint discoloration. No, not dust, this. This looks like a specific type of pollen. My finger tapped the screen, indicating the almost invisible specks. And not just any pollen. This type, if my eyes aren't deceiving me, usually comes from a specific variety of mountain pine, common in high-altitude forested regions. Not typically found at sea level, certainly not in a sealed, filtered, clean room environment like this. Not unless someone brought it in. The silence in the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene stretched, thick and sudden. The detective's brow furrowed, a slow comprehension dawning in his eyes. He looked from the tablet to the sprawling, coastal landscape outside, then back to me. The nearest mountain pine forest was a good 50 miles inland over rough terrain. So, someone was in there, he murmured, his voice now a low rumble of realization. And they brought a piece of the outside world with them. I nodded, the hum of the unit now sounding less like a beast, more like a conspirator. My initial hunch had been correct. The impenetrable fortress had a breach, a microscopic one, but a breach nonetheless. The silent language of the crime scene had just spoken its first word, and it contradicted everything they thought they knew. This was going to be anything but simple. Ted, the initial reports. The silent language of the crime scene had just spoken its first word, and it contradicted everything the first responders had been told. I straightened up from the polished marble floor, my gloved fingers still hovering over the almost imperceptible scuff mark I'd found near the main entrance. It wasn't deep, barely a whisper of friction against the pristine surface, but it was there. And it wasn't from the victim's Italian leather loafers, which lay neatly by the entryway untouched. This tiny imperfection, a mere fraction of a millimeter, suggested a different shoe, a different entry, or, at the very least, an overlooked detail. My mind, a labyrinth of interconnected data points, immediately flagged it as an anomaly. The scene is secured, UserKK. We're ready for transport when I am. The detective's voice rumbled, pulling me back to the present. He stood a respectful distance away, his expression a practiced blend of patience and professional curiosity. I nodded, peeling off the outer layer of gloves. Good. Let's get the body to the unit. I need to go over everything under a microscope and bag all the clothing carefully. The transfer was efficient, a silent ballet performed by trained professionals. The victim, now a carefully wrapped package of potential evidence, was moved with precision. I followed, my gaze sweeping the opulent yet sterile interior of the smart home one last time. Every sleek surface, every automated panel screamed control. Yet that tiny scuff mark, that whisper of an intrusion, gnawed at me. Minutes later, I was stepping into the humming heart of the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene. It was a familiar sanctuary, a meticulously organized world of stainless steel, bright lights, and specialized equipment. The air, conditioned to a precise temperature, carried the faint, clean scent of disinfectant and ozone. This was where the real conversation with the silent witnesses began. I shucked off my outer crime scene suit, hanging it carefully in the decontamination zone, and moved to the central examination table. The victim lay before me, carefully positioned, his expensive suit now a canvas of potential clues. My colleagues, two dedicated evidence technicians, were already cataloging external items, their movements precise and economical. "All right," I said, my voice low, almost a murmur, as I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. "Let's start with the clothing. Bag each piece individually, paying close attention to any foreign fibers or residues. I want a full sweep for trace evidence before we even think about the post-mortem." The meticulous process began. The jacket, then the shirt, the trousers, each item carefully removed, photographed, and placed into its own evidence bag. I ran a specialized vacuum over the fabric, collecting microscopic particles, each one a potential breadcrumb. My eyes, trained to spot the minutest detail, scanned every seam, every fold. Nothing immediately jumped out, no obvious blood spatter, no tears, no signs of a struggle that would mar the pristine fabric. Too clean. That was the first impression, and it always made me suspicious. Then, as I carefully examined the victim's left sleeve just above the cuff, I saw it. A faint discoloration, almost a smudge, no larger than a pinhead. It wasn't dirt, nor was it blood. It had a peculiar, almost iridescent quality under the powerful examination lamp. I leaned closer, my breath held, adjusting the focus of my handheld magnifier. "Hold on," I instructed, my voice barely audible. "Let me take a closer look at this." I carefully used a pair of sterile tweezers to lift a minuscule fragment from the discoloration. It was plant matter, undeniably, but not just any plant matter. Under the microscope, its cellular structure revealed a very specific, almost alien pattern. Not the kind of place a tech mogul living in a climate-controlled smart home would typically frequent, and certainly not the kind of growth that would be found in his perfectly manicured, sterile indoor garden. My brow furrowed. This tiny fragment, a silent witness clinging to the fabric, spoke volumes. It contradicted the narrative of a victim confined to his impenetrable digital fortress. This wasn't just a breach. It was a journey. The killer, in their meticulous planning, had overlooked this one, almost invisible botanical signature. The mystery, which I thought was confined to the smart home, had just expanded its borders exponentially. The air in the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene hummed with a low, constant thrum of machinery, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the mogul's mansion. Fluorescent lights, unforgiving and sterile, cast sharp shadows as I bent over the microscope, the minuscule fragment of plant matter held firmly in place on the slide. My sterile tweezers, still in my gloved hand, felt like an extension of my own focused intent. This wasn't just any moss. My earlier observation had been correct. Its cellular structure, now magnified several hundred times, was indeed peculiar. The cell walls were unusually thick, almost chitinous, and arranged in a fractal-like pattern I'd only ever seen in highly specialized botanical texts, the kind that detailed extremophile flora from forgotten corners of the world. It was a Bryum arcticum variant, or at least something genetically very close, but with mutations that suggested either extreme adaptation or deliberate genetic modification. Facts first. I remembered the odd discoloration on the victim's skin, a faint greenish-blue tinge. Could this moss be responsible? Or was it merely a contaminant, a red herring dragged in by an unwitting foot? The crime scene had been meticulously clean, almost obsessively so. A stray fragment of rare moss felt entirely out of place, an anomaly that screamed for attention. Pushing the microscope aside, I turned to the array of chemical analysis equipment lining the cramped workspace. My toxicology screen needed to be broad, but the moss offered a starting point. If it was involved, it likely contained unique compounds. I retrieved the tissue samples I'd taken from the victim: a sliver of liver, a fragment of muscle, a few milliliters of blood. Each was meticulously labeled, logged, and ready for processing. The preparation was a familiar dance: precise pipetting, solvent extraction, centrifugation. The methodical steps were a comfort, a way to channel the tension that had been tightening my shoulders since I first stepped into that opulent, deadly smart home. I loaded the first set of samples into the gas chromatography mass spectrometry (GCMS) machine, its internal pumps and valves sighing into action. While the GCMS worked its magic, I returned to the moss. I took a tiny piece and prepared it for a separate analysis, a targeted search for alkaloids or unusual proteins. The initial thought was that it might be a direct irritant or a contact poison, but the mogul had no visible lesions or allergic reactions beyond the discoloration. It felt more insidious, something absorbed, something that worked from the inside. The GCMS beeped, signaling the completion of its run. I pulled up the chromatogram on the screen. Peaks and valleys danced across the display, each representing a compound identified in the victim's blood. Most were standard, the usual metabolic byproducts, pharmaceuticals, and environmental exposures one might expect. But then my eyes snagged on a cluster of small, sharp peaks that were distinctly not standard. These peaks corresponded to molecular weights I didn't immediately recognize. They weren't on any of my common toxin databases. My fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing, running spectral matches. Nothing. Not a single hit for any known poison, drug, or even industrial chemical. This was perplexing. It suggested something novel, or something so obscure it hadn't been widely cataloged. I leaned back, a knot forming in my stomach. A determined glint in my eye, I pulled up the Moss analysis results. The preliminary screen for alkaloids was negative, as was the protein assay. This moss wasn't directly poisonous in the conventional sense. It wasn't delivering a dose of ricin or curare. But then I looked closer at the moss's own GCMS profile, run concurrently. There, nestled among the usual plant lipids and carbohydrates, were traces of the exact same unknown compounds I'd found in the victim's blood. The peaks were smaller, less pronounced in the moss itself, but undeniably present. My breath hitched. The moss wasn't just a contaminant, it was a carrier, or more disturbingly, a component. This changed everything. The rare moss with its alien cellular structure wasn't the toxin itself, but it contained the precursors, or perhaps it facilitated the production of the toxic agent. This wasn't a simple poisoning, it was a biological puzzle. The implications were vast. If the moss contained these compounds, how did they get into the mogul system? Was it ingested, inhaled? And if the compounds were so obscure, who would even know about them, let alone how to weaponize them? This wasn't the work of a casual killer. This pointed to someone with specialized knowledge, someone who understood botany, chemistry, and toxicology at a very advanced level. I stared at the two chromatograms, the victim's blood and the moss sample, the identical, unidentifiable peaks glowing faintly on the screen. The mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene, usually a place of sterile certainty, now felt like a conduit to a deeper, more unsettling mystery. I had to identify those compounds. That was the next, most critical step. My determination hardened, resolving to peel back every layer of this intricate botanical deception. Fluorescent lights, unforgiving and sterile, cast sharp shadows as I bent over the microscope, the minuscule fragment of plant material now magnified 100-fold. My eye ached from the intensity, but I couldn't pull away. Under the harsh glare, the specimen resolved into distinct cellular structures. Not a leaf, not a petal. It was a fragment of something tougher, more resilient. A pale green, almost grayish, with a fuzzy, almost velvety texture at this magnification. It looked like lichen, a very specific type if my initial assessment was correct. Lichens thrive in conditions that are often overlooked, clinging to rocks, bark, even concrete. They need moisture, but they are incredibly hardy. I carefully adjusted the focus, tracing the edge of the sample. No soil, no other debris clinging to it. Just this lone piece, perfectly preserved on the adhesive lift. My mind immediately flashed to the immaculate interior of the smart home, an environment meticulously controlled, sanitized, utterly devoid of the damp, varied surfaces where lichen typically flourishes. The mansion was a sealed ecosystem of polished steel, glass, and climate-controlled air. How could this have gotten inside? More importantly, how could it have gotten onto the victim? I leaned back, my neck protesting, and rubbed my temples. This was either a fantastic red herring or a critical piece of the puzzle that refused to fit the existing narrative. I pulled out my tablet, cross-referencing images of various lichen species against the morphology I just observed. A few minutes of searching led me to a promising candidate, a species of Xanthoparmelia, common in temperate climates, often found on granite or basalt. It was a slow-growing organism, not something easily brushed off a houseplant. This suggested a transfer from an outdoor surface, perhaps a large rock or a wall. Anything interesting, UserKK? The voice of the digital forensics colleague, a younger specialist with an uncanny ability to untangle encrypted data, cut through my thoughts. He stood by my workstation, a coffee mug steaming in his hand, his eyes bright with a mixture of curiosity and exhaustion. He'd been pulling 12-hour shifts since we arrived. Potentially, I replied, gesturing to the microscope. A fragment of Xanthoparmelia lichen. He was founded on the victim's left sleeve just above the cuff. It's not something you'd expect to find in that pristine smart home. The digital forensics colleague peered into the eyepiece, his brow furrowing. Lichen, like from a rock. Precisely, or a wall, something exposed to the elements. The mansion's exterior had some decorative stone elements, didn't it? Very modern, clean lines, but still stone. He nodded slowly. Yeah, a big retaining wall on the west side near the service entrance. Granite, I think, and some polished basalt pavers leading up to the main gate. But the security logs for the entire perimeter are solid. Not a single breach, not even a squirrel triggering a sensor for the past 48 hours leading up to the discovery. My internal alarm bells began to chime. Are you certain? No anomalies at all? Absolutely. We've been through the external camera feeds pixel by pixel, the pressure plates, motion sensors, laser grids, the whole 9 yards. The smart home's external defenses were fortress-grade and operating perfectly. No forced entry, no unauthorized access. The only people who entered or left that property in the critical window were the housekeeper and the groundskeeper, both with valid access codes and both cleared hours before the incident. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee, and of course the emergency responders and us after the fact. I pushed away from the microscope, the hum of the unit suddenly feeling louder, more insistent. This was the contradiction. Physical evidence, small as it was, pointed to an interaction with an outdoor natural surface. Digital evidence, comprehensive and seemingly infallible, screamed that no such interaction could have occurred. The smart home was a sealed box, its digital sentinels unwavering. Any fluctuations, damp spots, anything that could support lichen growth even temporarily. He shook his head decisively. Negative. Climate control logs show constant temperature, humidity levels within a tight band. Air filtration system running optimally. The air inside that house was drier than a desert bone. Not a place for any Xanthoparmelia to thrive, let alone get transferred onto someone. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the two facts. Either the lichen fragment was an ancient, unrelated contaminant, highly unlikely given its fresh appearance, or the digital logs were lying. But how could a smart home, a machine designed for objective data collection, lie? It didn't have motive or malice. Yet the implications were stark. If the physical evidence was true, then the digital evidence, which presented such a clear, unbreached narrative, had to be incomplete, manipulated, or outright false. This wasn't just a breach of security, it was a ghost in the machine. A killer who didn't just circumvent a fortress but somehow rewrote its history. It meant the digital trail, which we had initially considered gospel, was now suspect. Every log, every timestamp, every sensor reading had to be reevaluated, not for simple error, but for deliberate deception. The seemingly perfect crime wasn't perfect because it left no trace, but because it left a trail of misleading ones, designed to send us chasing phantoms. This case had just become infinitely more complicated. The murderer wasn't just clever, they were technologically sophisticated, capable of not just breaking into a system, but breaking the very concept of objective truth it represented. And I was going to have to find out how. The hum of the filtration system in the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene was a constant, low thrum against the taut silence of my thoughts. Outside, the vast manicured grounds of the tech mogul's estate stretched into the twilight, a stark contrast to the sterile, metal-lined confines I now inhabited. The contradiction of the fresh lichen fragment and the smart home's unblemished digital logs gnawed at me, a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. Machines didn't lie, not in the way humans did. Their data was objective, a cold, hard truth. Yet here I was, staring at an anomaly that screamed deception. I leaned over the stainless steel examination table, the harsh overhead lights reflecting off the polished surface. Spread before me were the victim's clothes, a bespoke suit, meticulously tailored, now a canvas of microscopic clues. I'd gone over them initially, of course, looking for fibers, hairs, anything out of place. But the lichen had changed everything. It wasn't just on the victim. It suggested the victim, something they interacted with, had been outside in a very specific, wild environment, one far removed from the pristine perfection of this property. Back to square one, rather square .001, I muttered to myself, adjusting the focus on the stereo microscope. My eyes ached from hours of peering into the miniature worlds of trace evidence. I picked up the victim's blazer again, its expensive wool feeling heavy in my gloved hands. I ran a lint roller across it, not for collection this time, but as a preliminary sweep, then carefully peeled off the adhesive sheet, placing it under the scope. The usual suspects paraded across the field of view: common dust motes, synthetic fibers from the victim's own shirt, a stray cat hair likely from the estate's resident Persian, according to the detective. But I wasn't looking for the obvious. I was looking for the impossible. I moved the slide with agonizing slowness, my breath held, searching for anything that mirrored the unique texture or composition of the lichen fragment. There had to be something. Then a flicker. A cluster of minute, iridescent particles, almost like crushed mica but with a distinct crystalline structure. They weren't uniform, some were elongated, others jagged, catching the light in a way that spoke of geological rather than synthetic origin. I'd seen similar particles before, dismissed them as environmental dust. But now, with the lichen in mind, my perspective sharpened. I carefully extracted a few of the particles using micro-tweezers, transferring them to a clean slide. Under higher magnification, their true nature became clearer. They were tiny, translucent silicate crystals, each no larger than a grain of fine sand, but with an unusual, almost reddish tint. These weren't common urban grit. These were specific. I remembered seeing geological samples with similar characteristics during my university days, often found in areas with specific volcanic activity or ancient rock formations, places where certain types of hardy lichens thrived. My heart gave a small, involuntary lurch. This wasn't just dust. This was a signature that, combined with the lichen, painted a picture of the victim having been in a very specific, remote, and natural outdoor environment. He stood at the entrance of the unit, his face etched with a familiar blend of exhaustion and impatience. Any breakthroughs? We're running out of angles on this no forced entry thing. I turned, a thrill of discovery battling with the immense implications of what I'd found. "Come see this," I said, my voice betraying a hint of urgency. I gestured for him to look into the microscope. He peered in, adjusting the focus slightly. "What am I looking at? More dust?" "Look closer," I urged. "These are silicate crystals, and they match the specific geological composition I found embedded in the lichen fragment from the victim's hand. They're not from the estate's garden, not from any local soil I've analyzed so far. These are from a very specific, remote, and geologically distinct outdoor environment." The detective straightened, his brow furrowing. "So, I rest saying the victim was outside. After all, the smart home logs showed no exits or entries." "That's exactly what I'm saying," I confirmed, stepping back from the scope. "These particles, along with the lichen, suggest the victim was not only outside, in a rather rugged natural setting, one that allowed these microcrystals to become deeply embedded in his clothing. This wasn't a quick trip to the mailbox." He rubbed his chin, his gaze distant. "But the logs, the security system is top tier. Not a single breach, not a single door or window opened without authorization. We've checked it a dozen times." "Then the logs are lying," I stated, the words hanging heavy in the air. "Or more accurately, they've been made to lie. This evidence points to a deliberate circumvention of the system, a manipulation far more sophisticated than simply disabling a sensor. The killer didn't just commit murder. They orchestrated a ghost in the machine, making it appear as if the victim never left. No one ever entered. The detective stared at the particles on the slide, then back at me, a new kind of tension hardening his jaw. A ghost in the machine, he repeated slowly. So, the killer didn't just get in and out unseen. They made the house believe they weren't there, or they made the house believe the victim was still inside when he wasn't. I nodded, the implications spiraling. The impenetrable smart home wasn't impenetrable at all. It had been breached, but not by force. The mystery hadn't just deepened. It had become a whole new beast. The hum of the generator powering the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene was a dull thrum against the metal shell, a constant companion to my thoughts. Outside, the world was a canvas of muted greens and grays under a sky-threatening rain. Inside, the sterile glow of LED panels illuminated my workspace. I leaned over a digital tablet, its screen displaying a dense array of network logs, timestamps, and IP addresses. My eyes, weary from hours of sifting through the victim's life, traced the lines of data, searching for the ghost in the machine. The previous night's revelation, the smart home breached not by force, but by an unseen digital whisper, had shifted the entire landscape of the investigation. No longer was I just looking for a physical presence. I was hunting a digital phantom. A colleague, the digital forensics specialist, approached my station, a stack of printouts in their hand. We've cross-referenced the home's primary network activity with external pings and sensor data from the smart grid. There's something odd. They slid a sheet of paper onto the table next to my tablet. It was a timeline highlighting specific periods of network traffic. Odd how? I asked, my gaze already fixed on the printout. Fluctuations, the specialist explained, pointing to a series of spikes and dips. Not just normal usage. These bursts of activity, they look like rapid command sequences, almost like a script running. But the system logs them as internal, routine checks. The weird part is, they coincide with some minor environmental anomalies we picked up from the house's integrated sensors. My brow furrowed. Environmental anomalies. Nothing major, they clarified. A slight dip in the thermostat reading in the master bedroom, then a correction. A brief, almost imperceptible flicker in the kitchen lights, dismissed by the system as grid instability. Things I wouldn't notice unless I was looking for them, and certainly nothing that would trigger an alert. I leaned closer, my finger tracing the specialist's highlighted points. A dip in the thermostat, a light flicker, trivial on their own, but within the context of a digital breach, they sang a different tune. They weren't random, they were controlled. Show me the timestamps for these events, I requested, pushing my tablet closer. The specialist quickly synced their data. Immediately, a pattern began to emerge. The digital script activity, the thermostat dip, the light flicker, they all clustered around a very specific window, mere minutes before the estimated time of death. It wasn't just a breach to get in. I realized it was a performance. The perpetrator wasn't just accessing the system, they were interacting with it, making it dance to their tune. But why bother with such subtle manipulations? To what end? My mind went back to the autopsy. The victim had been found in his bed. No struggle, no signs of forced entry. The initial theory had been a medical event until the lack of immediate cause and the subtle inconsistencies at the scene had pointed me elsewhere. Now this. I remembered the slight chill in the master bedroom when I first entered, a chill that had seemed out of place for a house so meticulously climate-controlled. I dismissed it then, attributing it to an open window or a momentary lapse in the system. But what if it wasn't a lapse? What if it was deliberate? These commands, I mused, tapping the screen. They're not just about access, they're about control, altering minor environmental parameters. It's almost like they were testing the system's responsiveness or creating a distraction, however small. The specialist nodded slowly, or masking something else. If I can make a smart home system lie about its temperature or light levels, what else could I make it lie about? The question hung in the air, thick with implication. I stared at the data, the seemingly innocuous anomalies now screaming for attention. The thermostat dip, the light flicker. They weren't just random acts. They were part of a symphony of deception. Then it hit me, the very subtlety of the manipulations. This wasn't a brute force hack. This wasn't someone crashing through the digital front door. This was someone who understood the house's intricate operating system, its routines, its vulnerabilities, well enough to mimic its internal commands. They weren't just breaking in, they were impersonating the system itself. My eyes widened. The thermostat dip, I replied, thinking aloud, could have been to create a momentary discomfort, perhaps to stir the victim from a light sleep or make them adjust their covers. The light flicker, a brief visual disruption. To what purpose? The specialist asked. To distract, I answered, my voice firm. To draw attention away, even for a split second, from the actual method of attack. The impenetrable smart home had been tricked, not overcome. The killer hadn't just bypassed the security. They had used the security system against itself. They hadn't left a digital footprint of a breach. They had left a digital footprint of internal system activity. Reveal/discovery. This wasn't a generic hacker. This was someone with an intimate, deep-seated knowledge of smart home automation, specifically this brand or type of system. Someone who could not only gain access, but also write scripts that mimicked legitimate system functions, subtly altering the environment to their advantage. They understood the victim's digital ecosystem so profoundly that they could make it betray its owner. The implication was staggering. The suspect pool had just shrunk dramatically. We weren't looking for just anyone with basic hacking skills. We were looking for an architect of digital deception, a master of smart home protocols, perhaps even an insider with knowledge of the victim's specific setup, someone who could orchestrate a silent, almost invisible manipulation of an entire living space. My hand instinctively balled into a fist. The determined set of my jaw tightened. This killer wasn't just clever, they were arrogant. They believed they had committed the perfect crime, blending their actions into the background noise of a sophisticated digital environment. But the system, manipulated as it was, still spoke a language I was learning to understand, and it was telling me that this wasn't an ordinary murder. This was an assassination carried out with surgical digital precision. The tension in the unit, already palpable, now crackled with a new, sharper edge. We had a profile. Now we just needed a name. The hum of the servers in the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene was a familiar comfort, a white noise that usually helped me focus. But tonight, it felt like a low, anxious thrum beneath my skin. I was sitting hunched over a bank of monitors, my fingers flying across a keyboard, sifting through lines of code and data logs that scrolled endlessly. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee, a testament to the long hours I'd been putting in. The previous day's revelations had cracked the case wide open, even if no one else fully saw it yet. The impenetrable smart home hadn't been tricked, not overcome. They hadn't left a digital footprint of a breach. They had left a digital facade, a carefully constructed illusion designed to look like a system malfunction or perhaps an outside hack, while really the perpetrator had been inside all along. My gut tightened. This wasn't just clever, it was intimate. It spoke of someone who knew the system, knew the victim, and knew how I, or someone like me, would eventually trace the digital breadcrumbs. My eyes were gritty, burning from staring at the high-resolution displays. I downloaded every scrap of data from the victim's smart home server. Motion sensor logs, light schedules, thermostat adjustments, voice assistant commands, door lock activations, even refrigerator inventory updates. An overwhelming flood of daily life, all meticulously recorded. But within that ocean of mundane activity, I was searching for a ripple, a tiny tremor that didn't belong. "Come on," I muttered to myself, rubbing my temples. "Show me my hand." I'd been correlating the victim's known schedule with the smart home's automated routines. The initial reports had painted a picture of a typical night, the system performing its usual tasks. Lights dimming, doors locking at a set time, the climate control adjusting for sleep. but I'd found a subtle anomaly, something that had initially seemed too trivial to flag. A specific light fixture in the living room, one directly visible from the main security camera feed, had flickered. Not a system-wide power surge, just that one light. The system logs attributed it to a minor voltage fluctuation, a common occurrence in older wiring. But the rest of the house's lights, connected to the same grid, showed no such blip. It was like a single, discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. I zoomed in on the timestamp for that flicker. It was precise, occurring exactly 47 seconds before the main bedroom's smart lock registered an unauthorized access attempt, an attempt that the system had successfully blocked, according to the logs. Or so it claimed. My fingers flew, tracing the network pathways. The smart home system was designed with redundancy. If one device reported an anomaly, others would corroborate. I cross-referenced the light flicker with the camera feed. The feed for that precise moment was fuzzy, not totally gone, but degraded, like an old VHS tape. Another small, dismissible detail, except the system boasted military-grade image processing. A high-resolution camera degrading on its own. Unlikely. I pulled up the firmware version for that specific light fixture, then cross-referenced it with the camera. Both were running slightly older versions of their respective software. Not outdated enough to trigger an automatic update, but old enough that a specific, targeted exploit could be applied. The pieces began to coalesce, chilling me to the bone. The flickering light wasn't a malfunction, it was a distraction. A visual cue for the camera, timed perfectly to introduce a momentary glitch in the recording. While the camera was recovering or buffering through the degradation, the killer had done something. Something quick, something vital. I started pulling the raw data from the smart lock on the bedroom door. Not the summary log, but the deep-level access attempts, the microsecond handshake protocols, the encrypted data packets. It was like dissecting a conversation at the atomic level. And there it was. A phantom entry. The system had reported an unauthorized attempt, but the actual data showed a brief, successful authentication. Not with the victim's biometrics or a known guest key, but with a temporary, one-time access token. A token that had been generated internally by the system itself, then immediately purged after use. It was a ghost key, appearing and vanishing in less than a second, leaving only the unauthorized attempt as a smokescreen. The flicker, the blurred camera, the failed entry, all a carefully orchestrated sequence. My breath hitched. This wasn't an external hack. This was someone using a backdoor they themselves had created or knew intimately. Someone with administrator-level access, or who had exploited a vulnerability during the system's setup or maintenance. The digital facade wasn't just a cover-up, it was a taunt. Suddenly, the hum of the servers didn't sound comforting anymore. It was oppressive. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. I wasn't just looking at a crime scene. I was looking at a conversation, a meticulously crafted message from the killer. And the message was clear. I know how this system works better than anyone. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The only person with that level of intimate knowledge, the person who would have built or extensively maintained such a bespoke, complex smart home system, was. A sharp click echoed from the front of the mobile unit. It was the sound of the main door lock disengaging. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I hadn't locked it when I came in earlier, absorbed in my work, but I always activated the internal security protocol when I was alone. It was supposed to be sealed. My eyes darted to the small internal camera feed I had running on a corner monitor. The camera pointed at the unit's entrance, a small security measure I'd installed myself. The killer wasn't just good, they were here. They knew I was close. They knew what I was finding. My discovery wasn't just proof, it was a direct challenge. And it had put me in their crosshairs. The trap of truth had just snapped shut and I was inside it. A jolt of ice water shot through my veins. I hadn't locked it when I came in earlier, absorbed in my work, but I always activated the internal security protocol when. Well, I hadn't. Not this time. My oversight felt like a physical blow. The door creaked open slowly, a sliver of the oppressive night air invading the sterile space. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the faint glow of the crime scene lights in the distance. It wasn't the detective, whose broad frame I knew well. This person was leaner, their posture rigid. UserKK. The voice was calm, almost too calm, belonging to the victim's business partner. Working late, I see. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. The business partner. What were they doing here at this hour, at the remote crime scene? They weren't part of the active investigation team. My mind raced, trying to find a plausible explanation, but none surfaced that didn't involve a cold pit in my stomach. Just tying up some loose ends. I managed, my voice a little too tight, a little too high-pitched. I slowly lowered my hands from the keyboard, trying to appear casual, though every muscle in my body was screaming for me to bolt. The business partner took another step, the subtle scent of expensive cologne preceding them. I thought I'd check on the progress. They answered, their eyes sweeping over the various screens displaying data, the trays of meticulously labeled samples. The detective mentioned you were close to a breakthrough. A breakthrough? Yes, I was, or rather I had been before the click. I swallowed, the dryness in my throat making it hard to speak. We're still processing a lot of information. It's a complex case. I tried to sound professional, detached. Inside, my mind was racing, trying to recall the last thing I'd been looking at, the most incriminating piece of data. Had they seen it? The business partner's gaze lingered on the microscope, then shifted to the large monitor displaying a magnified image of a single, almost invisible fiber. It was an unusual synthetic blend, not common in household textiles. I'd found it embedded in the victim's palm, a tiny shard of evidence. Fascinating, they murmured, stepping closer to the monitor. Their shadow fell across my workstation. What's that? Just a fiber, I responded, trying to keep my tone neutral. Likely from the victim's clothing or perhaps a blanket. It was a lie, a desperate attempt to throw them off. I knew it wasn't from the victim. I'd already cross-referenced it. The business partner chuckled, a soft, unsettling sound. You forensic types always finding the most obscure things. Me, I prefer the bigger picture. Motives, opportunities. They paused, then added, you know, the victim and I had a disagreement recently over a new product line. He was stubborn. It wasn't a confession, not directly, but it felt like a testing of the waters, a subtle probing. I met their gaze, trying to project an air of calm confidence I didn't feel. Disagreements are common in business. Indeed, they replied, their eyes now fixed on me. But some disagreements can be fatal, wouldn't you say? My stomach clenched. This wasn't a casual visit. They were here for a reason, and that reason was me and what I knew. I had to finish. I had to expose them. I subtly shifted my weight, positioning myself closer to the keyboard, my fingers itching to resume typing. The smart home system, I began, changing the subject. It was incredibly secure. No forced entry, as you know. The killer had to have had access, either physical or digital. The business partner's expression didn't change. A flicker in their eyes told me I was on the right track. He trusted very few people with that kind of access. Exactly. I pressed on, my voice gaining a fragile strength. And the system logs show a series of unusual override commands just before the time of death. Commands that disabled specific security protocols, then reactivated them after the fact, almost like a ghost moving through the system. I looked directly at the business partner, but ghosts don't leave fibers. My fingers found the enter key. The screen flickered, and a new data set populated. It's a specific polymer blend used in high-tech, custom-fabricated components. Components like the specialized miniature drone that was designed to navigate the victim's smart home's internal ventilation system, which I, as his business partner, had unique access to the schematics for. The business partner's placid mask finally cracked. Their jaw tightened. A drone? That's absurd. How could a drone? It's not just any drone, I interrupted, my eyes scanning the final results on the screen. It was a prototype. One designed for discreet surveillance with a manipulator arm, a prototype that, according to the victim's private R&D logs I just accessed, was your pet project. And this fiber, this exact polymer, was used in the drone's specialized, silent propulsion system, designed to avoid detection by the smart home's internal sensors. My gaze dropped to the screen, then back up to their face. The drone, small enough to enter through an external vent, delivered a fast-acting neurotoxin, which explains the lack of struggle and the immediate collapse. No struggle, no forced entry, just a silent, unseen killer. The override commands. They were to create a temporary blind spot in the smart home's network, allowing the drone to enter and exit without triggering alarms. I knew the system inside out better than anyone. I pointed to the monitor, where the spectral analysis now showed a definitive match. And this fiber, found embedded in the victim's hand, is a perfect match for the material used in my prototype drone's propulsion unit. He must have instinctively grabbed at it in his last moments. The business partner's face was a mask of furious realization. The calm was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate anger. They took a step forward, their hand moving towards their jacket pocket. The air in the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene crackled with a sudden, dangerous energy. The final thread was pulled, and the entire tapestry of deception was unraveling. The air in the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene crackled, not just with the hum of the ventilation system, but with a sudden, dangerous energy. The business partner's face, moments ago a mask of furious realization, contorted further as their hand plunged into their jacket pocket. My gaze flickered from their hand to the detective, whose own posture had subtly shifted, muscles tensed, ready. "Don't." The detective's voice was a low growl, devoid of its usual calm. The business partner ignored them, their fingers fumbling with something unseen. A primal alarm blared in my mind. This wasn't the controlled environment I usually worked in, the sterile quiet where evidence spoke without interruption. This was raw, volatile. My heart gave a single, hard thump against my ribs, but my hands, surprisingly, remained steady, gripping the edge of the examination table. I had to finish this. The truth, however inconvenient, had to be spoken. Just as the business partner began to pull their hand free, a blur of motion. The detective moved with surprising speed for their bulk, stepping forward and clamping a hand down on the business partner's wrist, twisting it sharply. A sharp cry of pain tore through the unit. Whatever was in the pocket clattered to the floor, a small, innocuous-looking key fob, not a weapon. The look in the business partner's eyes was certainly hostile enough to make me question that assumption. "I think IRS so clever, don't I, UserKK?" The business partner spat, struggling against the detective's grip, playing God with my little fibers and timestamps. "I'm not playing God," I stated, my voice cutting through the snarls. "I'm just reading what's left behind." I looked directly into their enraged eyes, ignoring the struggle. The victim's smart home system, as we discovered, had a hidden, manual override protocol, a backdoor created by the victim himself for emergency maintenance. It allowed for remote, untraceable access to specific environmental controls, overriding the primary security logs. The business partner went rigid. The detective tightened their grip. "We initially thought the system was impenetrable," I continued, my gaze unwavering. But the victim's genius also contained a fatal flaw. He coded this override with a unique, almost imperceptible digital signature. A kind of digital fingerprint. It wasn't designed to be hidden from him, only from the system's external logs. The problem for I, though, is that it wasn't designed to be hidden from a deep forensic dive. I paused, letting the words sink in. The business partner's breathing was ragged. "We found that signature in the system's deeper cache," I explained. A brief activation at 3:17 a.m., precisely when the environmental controls for the ventilation system spiked, creating the conditions for the unique microclimate we observed. It was deactivated less than a minute later. An external IP address was logged for that activation. I picked up a tablet from the table, displaying a complex string of data. This IP address wasn't the victim's. It wasn't any known maintenance server. It belonged to a private, encrypted VPN network. A network, ironically, that the victim himself helped I set up for my offshore accounts last year. We cross-referenced it with my recent travel logs and found a match. I was in a hotel suite across the city, accessing that VPN at 3:17 a.m. The business partner's face was now a ghastly shade of white, the anger replaced by a chilling despair. The victim trusted I added, a slight tremor in my voice, not from fear, from the weight of the revelation. He gave I the keys to his kingdom, digital and otherwise. I used that trust and his own ingenious failsafe against him. I remotely manipulated the environment, creating the perfect conditions for his pre-existing medical condition to become fatal, making it look like a natural occurrence in his impenetrable home. The business partner let out a choked sound, half sob, half curse. He was going to cut me out, they rasped, the words tumbling out laced with venom and self-pity. After everything I built with him, he was going to take it all. I just wanted to teach him a lesson, not to kill him. I didn't think it would. Their voice trailed off, lost in a sudden rush of tears and desperate justifications. The detective, having heard enough, produced a pair of handcuffs. The metallic click echoed loudly in the confined space of the mobile forensic unit at remote crime scene, a final, brutal punctuation mark to the confession. The business partner offered no further resistance, slumping as they were led out of the unit, their furious energy now utterly drained. The unit fell silent again, save for the low hum of the equipment and the distant chirping of crickets from the surrounding woods. I stood there, tablet still in hand, looking at the empty space where the business partner had been. The tension, which had coiled tight in my stomach for days, slowly began to unravel, leaving behind a profound weariness. I walked over to the small window, looking out into the twilight. The smart home, a monument to human ingenuity and isolation, stood dark against the fading sky. The victim, brilliant and trusting, was gone. The killer, driven by greed and betrayal, was apprehended. My role was done. Forensics, I reflected, wasn't about heroes or villains in the traditional sense. It was about listening to the quiet stories told by dust motes, by digital echoes, by the invisible fingerprints left on reality. It was about giving a voice to the silent, making sense of the chaos, and ultimately ensuring that the truth, however convoluted or painful, found its way into the light. And I, UserKK, was merely the interpreter, the one tasked with reading the enduring power of its truth. A heavy burden, perhaps, but a necessary one. The world moved on, but the echoes of what happened, the evidence, always remained. And I would always be there to listen.